Well, happy Monday morning to you, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. And let me remind you right up front of the formal public debate that I will be having June 15th and 16th with Dr. David Hester in Montgomery, Alabama. Please make your plans to be there if you can at all. Also, my formal YouTube debate with Dr. Jaime Pickett was delayed. Unfortunately, Dr. Pickett's father-in-law is gravely ill and is expected to pass from this world very shortly. So we have at this time rescheduled that YouTube debate for May the 10th, 2017, of course. And our hearts and our sympathies certainly go out to the family of Dr. Pickett, his wife especially. So, nonetheless, keep those things in mind. Don't forget, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, July 13th through the 15th, right here in Ardmore. Our theme this year is the problems with postmillennialism. So, you don't want to miss that. We've got 3 speakers this year that we've never had before. This is going to be an excellent seminar. Look, I have people tell me all the time that the writings of Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, Joel McDermott are the reason why they become full preterists. So we're going to be examining the postmillennial view of eschatology and basically why it leads to covenant eschatology. So again, you don't want to miss this. This is going to be great. Okay, well, we've been involved in we are involved in a thematic study of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. For the last few videos, I have been sharing with you what Paul has to say about dishonor versus honor and glory. And that's a very, very important concept. And we've discussed the substitutionary death of Christ. We have discussed forgiveness and how all of this is absolutely directly related. Now look, people ask the question all the time, how is forgiveness of sin related to the resurrection? Well, Paul relates it directly in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 and following when he says, if the dead ones are not raised, guess what? You are yet in your sin. There is a direct relationship, a direct bearing in 1 Corinthians 15 in between Paul's doctrine of the resurrection and salvation through forgiveness of sin, the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. We cannot separate those and say, well, forgiveness has to do with conversion, not resurrection. That's not Paul's doctrine. Now, we've also been involved in some word studies. From 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we have taken a look at the word corruption, phathora, and incorruption, aphathora. We have looked at the dishonor, the atomia, versus the glory. Now, I want you to notice that he continues this concept of shame versus glory when he says, and we're 1 Corinthians 15:43, it is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. Now, he uses the word weak, the word that is translated weakness, is athenia. And in its 3 different forms, athenia, athenio, and athenes, we want to take note for absolute honesty and objectivity's sake. Athenia is a word. It is used some 24, 25 times in the New Testament. And it can and does refer to physical sickness, physical illness. Same with athenio. It is sometimes simply translated as sickness. However, just like atomia, dishonor, this is a word that very often also has a moral element to it. May I even use the word psychological element to it. In other words, it is not a word that is used exclusively to talk about physical weakness. Abraham was not weak in flesh when God made the promise to him that in he and his seed all the nations would be blessed. He was not weak in flesh. Well, it obviously doesn't mean physical illness there. Paul said in Romans chapter 6 and verse 19, "Brethren, I speak after the manner of men because of the weakness of your flesh." Well, there you see. Well, then he explains what he means. "For," that's the connective particle, "for as you have yielded your members to unrighteousness, unto uncleanness," or to uncleanness unto unrighteousness, "even so now yield your members unto righteousness and unto holiness." This is a moral weakness versus power. And what's fascinating about atheneo, and athenes, when it is used in context of weakness or infirmity versus power and glory, it almost invariably has this moral element to it. In other words, when the contrast is between weakness versus power, weakness versus glory, which is obviously the contrast in 1 Corinthians 15:43, it is not a contrast between physical sickness versus physical health. Not at all. It is the contrast between the human frailty of living a life opposed to God versus a life empowered by God to triumph over the moral, psychological weakness. So, when we consider the following, when Paul says, "It is sown in dishonor," atomia is raised in glory. Well, I've already shared with you that this has to do with the shame versus glory, which is always a moral and a spiritual concept. It is not a dishonorable physical body versus an honorable or glorious physical body. So here is Paul using atomia versus glory, and then he uses these other words, atheneo, in the same identical way. In other words, Paul is using what might be called a Hebrew parallelism. Now, a Hebrew parallelism is that you're saying the same identical thing, just in a different way. Now, if that's the case, I'm convinced it is. If that's the case, then we have to focus one more time on the "it is sown in dishonor," atomia, versus raised in glory. It is the shame versus glory motif. Now let me say again, yes, this atheneo can be used in some context, very often as a matter of fact, to speak of physical sickness. I'm not disputing that. What I am pointing out is that when it is used in context of atheneo versus glory or power or strength, that it has a moral and spiritual element to it that is not focused on physical sickness. Secondly, I am noting that Paul is using a Hebrew parallelism here, which means that his focus is on shame versus glory, which is not related to physical shame over a physical body, but rather having to do with a moral shame versus moral glory. When we consider these elements, these usages of the words, once again, we see that Paul is not talking about a vile human body. A vile human body of physical flesh. He is rather talking about the weakness of the human condition, the weakness of the moral human condition, versus the glory of the life in Christ, lived in submission and obedience to Christ. And we will drive that home even more by looking at more of Paul's words that he uses here that reinforces the fact that Paul is simply not talking about the human physical body. In the meantime, where'd it go? RS. Don't forget, get yourself a copy of the book, The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ by Daniel Rogers. This new book does all of these word studies, okay? And it demonstrates, as I've been sharing with you ever so briefly, that these words do not speak of the human physical condition, but rather the human life lived in opposition to God versus the life of glory and power and exaltation of a life lived in obedience to Christ. So get yourself a copy of this. Go to my website, BibleProphecy.com. Order the book. The total cost will be $8. Okay? Just send me a note reminding me that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund everything except $8. Okay, thanks again for being with me on this morning's Morning Musings. We will see you on the flip side.